Hey guys, and welcome to our next unit. I am so excited to start this one with you guys because it's not only one of my favorite books, but it's typically one of my students' favorite as well, especially because it's such a relatable text, and it's a really important text that Harper Lee has kind of crafted this for us. So we are starting To Kill a Mockingbird, and this will take us into Christmas break. And so this week, what I wanted to do is just a lot of intro stuff, get you guys used to the characters, some of the themes that we're going to be talking about. And then next week is when we're going to really start diving into the book. So before we kind of talk about the setting and the author and things like that, I want to get your brains kind of thinking about some of the themes that we're going to be seeing in To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, so think about this. Think about a time when you have either witnessed or you have experienced injustice. Now, this injustice can be based on your age, your gender, or your race, your ethnicity. Okay, these are things that you typically can't change. So, what was your reaction? What, if anything, could have been done to prevent or change that situation? Okay, so think about that kind of as we're kind of going through this, because that's something that most of the characters in the book all, for the most part, experience some type of injustice, whether it's the color of their skin, like Tom Robinson, or their gender, like Scout, or their age, like Jem. Okay, everyone kind of goes through some type of injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird. All right. So let's look at the text as a whole. All right. So as I said, we are starting To Kill a Mockingbird, which no, it does not mean you are physically killing a bird. Okay, that's not what it's talking about. Harper Lee is using the mockingbird as a symbol. It's kind of a metaphor, and we'll kind of get into that as we're kind of going through this presentation. But it's not about killing a bird. Okay, it's completely, it's a bigger story than that. So let's talk about Harper Lee. All right, she is our author of To Kill a Mockingbird. Fantastic writer. I love her so much. She has actually passed away now. She passed away just a few years ago. She actually passed away while my students were reading this book. I think it was in, I don't remember, 2016, I believe. And this is one of her only books that she has written. She read another one called Go Set for a Watchman. That was kind of like the sequel or the prequel of To Kill a Mockingbird. But for the most part, To Kill a Mockingbird was her only work. All right, so let's kind of go through her life. So she has a lot of similarities as our main character. And our main character is a little girl. Her name is Scout, but she's very similar to Harper Lee. So Harper Lee grew up in a small town in Alabama. Her dad was an attorney. Her mom's maiden name is Finch, which is the family name in the book. The plot is loosely kind of based on events that happened near her hometown in Alabama, which is where our story takes place. All right, so she published this book in 1960. Okay, so right around that civil rights era time. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. And then in 1962, the film version came out and it won 3 Academy Awards. And guys, it is fantastic. So well written, so good. Shortly after that, we know that that was kind of a big turmoil with what was happening in America during that time, right? The civil rights movement. We had everything with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And all of the riots and the protests and everything going on with before the civil rights movement got launched. And so for a long time, this book was actually banned. Okay, and so we're going to talk about that in one of our breakout sessions. But it wasn't until even really the later 90s, early 2000s that schools started to bring this text back and be like, no, you know what? This is important. Our kids need to read this book. And I completely agree. All right, so let's talk about the setting really quick. All right, so it is set in Macomb, Alabama. Now, Macomb, Alabama is not an actual town. Okay, it is a fictional town, which means it is not a real place, but it is based on a real place. Okay, so it takes place in Alabama. And then if you caught the time period, all right, the time period is from 1933 till about 1935. So it kind of spans across 2 to 3 years in the book. And so we kind of get to see the narrator Scout kind of grow up through the book. But think about that time period, okay? Yes, she wrote this during the civil rights movement, but the book is not set during that time. The book is set in the 1930s. Okay, so what was that? Well, we just had the Great Depression that happened, and so everyone was really, really stretched for money. It was really, really hard time for America, and that's another reason why I had you guys do a lot of that background reading on the Great Depression, because we'll be talking about why the setting is so important to really understanding these characters. All right, so let's talk about some of the main characters. All right, now I will preface. All right, there are a lot of nicknames in this story. Okay, so it can kind of get a little bit confusing for you guys. I'm going to provide you guys with a little character map that you can print out and kind of leave by your computer or leave as a bookmark in your book if you're getting the physical book. That sometimes it's helpful for students to look at it that way. Okay, but our first main character is our narrator. All right, and her name is Jean Louise Finch, but she goes by Scout. Okay, so Scout is a total tomboy. She's 6 years old at the beginning of the story. Her mom died when she was only 2, and so she's really been raised by her dad. Now, the reason why I love Scout is because the story is told from her perspective, right? So you have to keep that in mind as you're reading, right? It's not an adult telling you these things that are happening to them. It's a 6-year-old kid. Okay, so we kind of have to talk about that and talk about, well, what limits do we have based on that narrator? All right, how does that perspective kind of sway where the text is going? Does Scout actually know a lot of the bad racism that's happening around her and some of the injustice that's happening? Can she really even comprehend it? Because she's 6. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. But I will say, Scout is very tough and rough. All right, she is not the girly girl. She is definitely kind of one of the boys, if you would. She definitely likes to hang out with her brother Jim way more than being inside playing tea. That's not really her thing. All right, and then you have Jim, the brother. So his name is Jeremy Atticus Finch, but he goes by Jim. Okay, so Jim is the older brother. He's a couple years older than Scout, and he's just a smart, good kid. And for the most part, he really looks out for Scout. And he's very, very level-headed. We have to still remember, though, that even that he's the big brother, in which you guys maybe have younger siblings and you kind of have to like look out for them. Even though he is the older brother, he is still a little kid, right? He's like 13 when the book at the end of the book, and so he kind of grows up throughout the rest of the story too, and he's kind of balancing that theme that we talked about a lot between losing that innocence in order to gain compassion, right? We talked about that when we were looking at the poems and everything that we've read up until this point. All right, can you still have innocence while you have compassion, which is something we talked about with marigolds? That's something that Jim works on. And then you have my favorite character, Atticus Finch. All right, so Atticus Finch is phenomenal. So he is the widowed father. He is the dad for Scout and Jim. He is the attorney in their small town of Macomb, Alabama, and he's highly respected. Everyone in town loves Atticus when the book starts because he's very smart. He's very calm, very intellectual. He respects the law, and he thinks that everyone deserves justice. And because of that, he is well respected. He doesn't think that anyone should have favoritism. He is very much a very even-keeled, tempered man. But he gets into a little bit of trouble in the book because he is a white man who is defending a man named Tom Robinson, who we will talk about in a second. And then we have Dill. Okay, so Dill has a nickname. Like I said, I told you there was a lot of nicknames. So Charles Baker Harris is his name, but he goes by Dill. All right, so Dill is kind of this Merlin character. We kind of see him in a couple chapters because he's only there in the summer. He actually lives in Meridian, Mississippi, but he comes and stays with his Aunt Rachel during the summer and gets to hang out with Scout and Jim because he's kind of in the middle of their ages. Okay, and he's actually really small for his age, and they kind of talk about that in the book. That he's super, super tiny, and they compare his hair to like duck fluff and all of this stuff. But he's very imaginative, very playful. He's actually kind of a more complex character when you start getting towards the end of the book, because we learn that Dill actually lies a lot. And why does he lie? Well, he lies because he's really insecure about his home life. He doesn't have the best home life, and we kind of get to learn a little bit more about what his home life looks like in part 2. But he's a really, really fun character, and he's really important because he is the character that likes to get Scout and Jim into trouble. But without him getting them into trouble, we would miss a lot of the themes that are really, really important to the book. All right, and then we have a Boo. All right, so Arthur Radley is his name. We will actually meet him in chapter 1. So Arthur Radley, or Boo, is kind of this creepy, malevolent creature of a person, all right? He's this creepy neighbor that the kids have never seen. He has literally been kept in his house since day one. And so he lives 2 doors down from the kids. He never comes out. And he's rumored to like kill animals and peek into ladies' windows and poison the kids and all of this crazy, creepy stuff. In chapter 1, we're going to learn a lot more about Boo Radley, why he's locked up in his house, why he doesn't come out, and why the kids would be a little bit afraid of him. But he is definitely an extremely important character that we get to know very quickly. And then we have Calpurnia, all right, also known as Cal, but the kids really do call her Calpurnia most of the time. So she is the Finch family housekeeper, okay? So she grows up, or she helps raise the kids since Atticus lost his wife when Scout was just 2 and Jim was 5. And so she's been with the Finch family for a very, very long time. Now, Jim loves her. Scout, not so much. Scout, what did we say? She's that very tough, rough character, and Cal is very tough on her because typically Scout gets into a lot of trouble. So Calpurnia is very stern but loving with her, and Atticus really relies really heavily on her to really help raise the kids and keep up with the house. Now, Calpurnia is one of the few perspectives that we have of a Black character in To Kill a Mockingbird. Up until this point, all of our other characters have been white. Calpurnia is the one perspective that we really get to see more about what it was like living in that time period as a Black female during the 1930s. Okay, now she is friends with Tom Robinson. Okay, so Tom Robinson, we will talk a lot about Tom, but we won't really see him in part 1. He comes in part 2, but he's very, very, very important. So Tom Robinson is a Black man who is accused of raping a white woman. A very hard topic. Okay, and we're gonna really, really go through this slowly. But the trial really enthralls Macomb citizens. Everyone's obsessed with it. Everyone wants to know what happened. And think about that time period. Okay, Blacks and whites were still heavily segregated, and you definitely could not date anyone of the opposite race. And so the fact that we have a sexual relationship, much less an illegal sexual relationship, that's also rape. All right, you have a lot of layers that this court system has to go through. Now, it is very clear early on that Tom Robinson is innocent. There is no evidence to say that he actually did this crime, but it is a white man's word against a Black man's word. All right, very, very hard for that time period. But he is defended by Atticus. Now, what did we say about Atticus? Atticus is a strong man, genuinely believes that justice should be served to everyone, regardless of your age, your ethnicity, or your gender. So he's going to stick up for Tom. Well, why is that bad? Well, a white man going up another white man did not happen in the 1930s. All right, races had to kind of stick together and bond together. Well, if a white man says a yes, absolutely. But that's not what Atticus says. Atticus is like, no, what you're saying is not true. I believe Tom. And that gets Atticus into a lot of trouble. Okay. All right, now we have the Yule family. So we don't like them. Let's just go ahead and say that. The Yules are kind of what they call the white trash, is what they refer to them in the novel. I don't really like that idiom, but that's what, you know, how they're kind of described. So Mayella is the girl who's accusing Tom Robinson of raping her. Okay, and we'll get into this more in part 2. We won't have to worry about this in part 1, but we will meet Bob Yule, and we'll meet the younger Yule brother. Bob Yule is kind of this alcoholic, neglectful father. We learn even in chapter 2 that his family doesn't pay attention to the law. They don't like education. They're extremely rude to people. They steal, they cheat. All of these terrible attributes are associated with the Yule family. Mayella is just the oldest daughter. And yet, in this court system, all right, as they're watching this kind of unfold, everyone in the county knows that the Yules lie. But because they're white and we're going up against a black man, everyone's like, well, he's got to be telling the truth. I know he never tells the truth, but he's telling the truth now. Okay, so we'll kind of really kind of unravel that onion together. So let's look at the social hierarchy that would happen in Maycomb. Okay, so this is what the hierarchy would have looked like in America in the South in the 1930s. So you have the wealthy white men, and then the wealthy white women, the poor white men, the poor white women, because remember, women and men were definitely not equal during this time. And then you've got the really, really poor white people. This is where the Yules kind of fit in. And then you have African Americans, and then you have people of mixed race. Because remember, it was that whole idea of the Jim Crow law, the separate but equal. Obviously, we know that there is no such thing as being separate but equal, but this was the setting that Harper Lee was writing this for. Okay, and so the idea of mixing races is completely unheard of at the time. Absolutely not, because they didn't fit anywhere. You couldn't separate them because it was in one body. Okay, so that's kind of how the social hierarchy kind of fit, and that's important again when we get into part 2. All right, so we're not going to go into too much detail because you guys have already looked at the Great Depression, but what happened in the Great Depression? So this was basically when you had the big stock market crash, you had huge unemployment rates. Maycomb citizens suffered, just like every other citizen would suffer, and it was the longest or the lowest academic hit that America had ever faced. Okay, so it was very, very hard. Everyone lost their jobs, and everyone was really struggling just to make ends meet, put food on the table. Think about marigolds when we were talking about marigolds and how Eugenia Collar kind of painted that. It's the same type of setting, but just in the South. Okay. And then we had FDR was the president during the time. And so he came up with some solutions to try to help get the economy going back. And that was like the New Deal and the WPA and things like that. So they were working on it, but it was definitely a work in progress. Okay. So this story very loosely is based on real life. Okay. So Lee was influenced by the Scottsboro Boys trial, which very brief overview because we're going to go into a lot more detail once we get into part 2. All right. But the Scottsboro Boys trial was a very interesting trial that actually happened in Alabama. Okay, so it was in 1931 when 9 black teenagers were arrested in Paint Rock, Alabama. Basically, what happened, all right, the very short version, these 9 black teenagers got into a fight with another large group of white boys. All right, and so the train stopped. They're like, obviously, there's a big altercation. Let's stop the train. Everyone get off. 2 women got off of the train as well, and they accused all of those 9 boys of assaulting them. Now, they were all convicted guilty instantly, right? But once they started looking at the evidence showed, oh, no one was assaulted. They didn't actually get raped. It's no crime happened here. One of the boys was handicapped. Some of the boys weren't even on the same physical train as the girls. One of the girls, Ruby Bates, even came out after the trials had started when she found out that the penalty for rape of a white woman in the 1930s was death by electrocution. All right, she was like, "Oh shoot, these boys are gonna get killed." She's like, she recanted. She was like, "No, I lied. We were not raped. Sorry." But they were still convicted anyway, even after the woman who originally accused them said it didn't happen. They were still convicted guilty. And so it's this big long trial that goes on for years and years and years. Well, Harper Lee, was a young girl during this time, and she was watching this on the news and listening to it. And so she was, or more listening to it because they didn't really have news stations, but it enthralled everyone because it was the first time in American history when we really had people step up when we had the separate but equal laws and be like, no, that's not actually separate and equal. That's not justice, right? Those boys did not do anything, and that doesn't make sense. We can't kill them. It was false. All right, and so she was inspired to write To Kill a Mockingbird based on what she experienced when she was Scout's age, when she was little. Okay. All right, so like I said, the mockingbird is a very, very, very important symbol, okay? So, really quickly, mockingbirds sing only to please other people, right? The physical bird. All right, and therefore, it is considered a sin to shoot them. They are harmless creatures who give nothing but joy to the world. Now, think about that, how that could be a metaphor. So, as we're reading, I want you to be on a lookout for characters who might symbolically represent what it means to be a mockingbird. All right, now we have several different conflicts in this story. We have man versus man, we have man versus circumstance, man versus society, and then man versus himself. Okay, so lots of things to unpack there. We will definitely get into that. All right, it is still an extremely popular book today. There's over 30 million copies sold, and it's a fantastic piece of writing. I would have read Harper Lee's grocery list because I just think she is phenomenal. She's extremely descriptive and she does such a good job of creating a believable plot for us to really dive our teeth into. Okay, so that is where we are going to get started. So let me check the time. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 1 to you guys. Okay, so let me pull up. All right, so I'm going to read chapter 1 to you guys, and you guys are more than welcome to go back and read this on your own. But I kind of just wanted to go ahead and do the first chapter with you guys. That way you can have a little bit, you get a little bit used to the characters. Okay, so let's go through the first chapter with everything that we've talked about in mind, and then we'll get started. Okay, so she writes, Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In the rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks, the courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Beautiful writing. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning, and ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes of frosting of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores and around it, took their time about everything. The day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go and nothing to buy and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macon County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some people. Macon County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. We lived on the main residential street in town. Atticus, Jim, and I, plus Calpurnia, our cook. So remember who's talking here. We have Scout, who's our narrator, a 6-year-old girl. Jim and I found our father satisfactory. He played with us and read to us, and he treated us with courteous detachment. Calpurnia was something else. She was all angles and bones. She was nearsighted, she squinted, her hand was as wide as a bed slat and twice as hard. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave as well as Jim when she knew he was older, and calling me home when I wasn't ready to come. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jim was born, and I had felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember. Our mother died when I was 2, so I never felt her absence. She was a Graham from Montgomery. Atticus met her when he was first elected to the state legislature, because remember, he's an attorney. He was middle aged then, and she was 15 years his junior, which means she was 15 years younger. Jim was the product of their first marriage. 4 years later, I was born. 2 years later, our mother died from a sudden heart attack. They said it ran in her family. I didn't miss her, but I think Jim did. He remembered her clearly, and sometimes in the middle of a game, he would sigh at length and then go off and play by himself behind the car house. When he was like that, I knew better than to bother him. When I was almost 6 and Jim was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within calling distance of Calpurnia, were Mrs. Henry Lafayette's DeBose's house 2 doors to the north of us and the Radley place 3 doors to the south. We never attempted to break them. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity of mere description, of whom was probably to make us behave on days on end. Mrs. DeBose was playing hell. that was the summer that Dill came to us. Remember, Dill is the friend that comes for the summertime. Early one morning, as we were beginning our day's play in the backyard, Jim and I heard something next door to Miss Rachel's Haverford's collar patch. We went to the wired fence to see if there was a puppy. Miss Rachel's rat terrier was expecting. Instead, we found somebody looking at us. Sitting down, he wasn't much higher than the collards. We stared at him till he spoke. Hey, hi yourself, Jim said pleasantly. I'm Charles Baker Harris, and I can read. So what? So I just thought that you'd like to know I can read. If you got anything need reading, I can do it. How old are you? He asked Jim. 4.5? Going on 7. Shoot, no wonder then, said Jim, jerking his thumb at me. Scout's yonder been reading ever since she was born, and she ain't even started to school yet. You look right puny for going on 7. I'm little, but I'm old, he said. Jim brushed his hair back to get a better look. Why don't you come over, Charles Baker Harris, he said. Lord, what a name. It's no funnier than yours. Aunt Rachel said your name's Jeremy Atticus Finch. Jim scowled. I'm big enough to fit mine, he said. Your name's longer than you are. I bet it's a foot longer. Folks call me Dill, said Dill, struggling under the fence. Do better if you go over it instead of under it, I said. Where'd you come from? Dill was from Meridian, Mississippi, and was spending the summer with his aunt, Miss Rachel, and would spend every summer in Macomb from now on. His family was from Macomb County originally, but his mother worked for a photographer in Meridian, had entered his picture in a beautiful child contest, and won $5. She gave the money to Dill, and we went to the picture show 20 times on it. Don't have any picture shows here, except Jesus ones in the courthouse sometimes, said Jim. Ever seen anything good? Dill had seen Dracula, a revelation that moved Jim to eye him with the beginning of respect. Tell it to us, he said. Dill was a curiosity. He wore blue linen shorts that buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. As he told us the old tale, his blue eyes would lighten and darken. His laugh was sudden and happy. He habitually pulled at the cowlick in the center of his forehead. When Dill reduced Dracula to dust and Jim said the show sounded better than the book, I asked Dill where his father was. You ain't said anything about him? I haven't got one. Is he dead? No. Well, if he's not dead, then you got one, haven't you? Dill blushed. Jim told me to hush, a sure sign that Dill had been studied and found acceptable. Thereafter, the summer passed in routine contentment. Routine contentment was improving our treehouse that rested between giant twin China berry trees in the backyard, bussin', running through our list of dramas based on the works of Oliver Optic, Victor Appleton, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. In this matter, we were lucky to have Dill. He played the characters formerly thrust upon me. The Ape and Tarzan, Mr. Crabtree and the Rover Boys, Mr. Damien and Tom Swift. Thus we came to know Dill as a pocket Merlin, whose head teemed with eccentric plans, strange longings, and quaint fancies. But by the end of our repertoire was vapid from countless reproductions, and it was then that Dill gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. The Boo Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him as the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole on the corner, a safe distance from the Radley gate. There he would stand, his arm around the fat pole, staring and wondering. The Radley place jutted into a sharp curve beyond our house. Walking south, one faced its porch. The sidewalk turned and ran beside the lot. The house was low and was once white with a deep front porch and green shutters, but had long darkened to the color of the slate gray around it. Rain-rotted shingles drooped over the eaves of the veranda. Oak trees kept the sun away. The remains of a picket drunkenly guarded the front yard, a swept yard that was never swept, where Johnson grass and rabbit tobacco grew in abundance. Inside the house lived a malevolent phantom. People said he existed, but Jim and I had never seen him. People said he went out at night when the moon was down and peeped into windows. When people's azaleas froze in a cold snap, it was because he breathed on them. Any stealthy small crimes committed in Macomb were his work. Once the town was terrorized by a series of morbid nocturnal events. People's chickens and household pets were found mutilated. Although the culprit was Crazy Addie, who eventually drowned himself in Barker's Eddy, people still looked at the Radley place, unwilling to discard their initial suspicions. A Negro would not pass the Radley place at night. He would cut across the sidewalk opposite and whistle as he walked. The Maycomb School grounds adjoins the back of the Radley lot. From the Radley chicken yard, tall pecan trees shook their fruit into the schoolyard, but the nuts laid untouched by the children. Radley pecans would kill you. A baseball hit into the Radley yard was a lost ball, no questions asked. The misery of that house began before many years before Jim and I were born. The Radleys, welcome anywhere in town, kept to themselves. Predilection unforgivable in Maycomb. They didn't go to church, Maycomb's principal recreation, but worshipped at home. Mrs. Radley seldom, if ever, crossed the street for a mid-morning coffee break with her neighbors, and certainly never joined a missionary circle. Mr. Radley walked to town at 11:30 every morning and came back promptly at 12, sometimes carrying a brown paper bag that the neighborhood assumed contained the family's groceries. I never know how old Mr. Radley made his living. Jim said he bought cotton, a polite term for doing nothing. But Mr. Radley and his wife had lived there with their 2 sons as long as anyone could remember. The shutters and the doors of the Radley house were closed on Sundays, another thing alien to Maycomb's ways. Closed doors meant illness and cold weather only. Of all the days, Sundays was the day for formal afternoon visiting. Ladies wore corsets, men wore coats, children wore shoes. But to climb up to the Radley front steps and call, "Hey," on a Sunday afternoon was something that the neighbors never did. The Radley house had no screen doors. I once asked Atticus if they ever had any. Atticus said yes, but it was before I was born. All right, so the rest of chapter 1, I want you guys to look at it on your own. Okay, so it's not very long, it's just a little bit, I think it's like 4 more pages. But I want you to look at it and I want you to read it and tell me what you guys learn about why Boo Radley has been stuck in this house. Okay. And the kids are going to go up to this creepy house and do this crazy, it's kind of like a double dog dare. Like, I bet you won't go to the Radley house. Okay. So finish reading chapter 1 on your own. And then what I want you to do is answer the questions at the end of this video. All right. Let's just look at the very, very last part. Because I love the last line of this chapter. It says, "The old house was the same droopy and sick, but we stared down the street and we thought we saw an inside shutter move. Flick! A tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still." All right, so what you guys have to do is you have to now go back and you have to finish reading chapter 1. Okay, so we left off, let me see what page we left off at. I think this was the page. Yes, so we left off on page 10. So I want you guys to start at the according to the neighborhood legend, start off right here and finish chapter 1, and then you guys are good to go for today. All right, you can find this this PDF if you just go back to Thrivus and where it says To Kill a Mockingbird PDF, click on that PDF, go to page 10, and then you guys are good to go. You can also Google the text and just look up To Kill a Mockingbird free online, and it'll give you the rest of chapter 1 as well. All right, but that's your task. I hope this is helpful, and I hope you guys love these characters as much as I do as well. All right.